Most use of force incidents are not decided in the moment force is used. They are shaped minutes earlier, sometimes hours earlier, sometimes culturally, years earlier. We've talked about perception. We've talked about procedural justice. Now we need to talk about supervision, because supervisors control the environment where force decisions happen. Gabrielson, and host of the Blue Line Project, and welcome to today's show. I'm really excited to follow up on last week's episode as we talk about leadership and supervisors as it relates to use of force. Last week, we spent time talking about use of force and some of the myths that are involved in it, but also talking about time and distance and procedural justice and how that plays a role in the officers, and talking about the ICAD and different things that we're doing in the areas of de-escalation to make things much better. And so I'm looking forward to this episode. But just before we get started, if you like what we're doing here and you want to support us, please like this video, share it with all your friends, get the word out, follow us on, Rumble or YouTube, or wherever you can find the show, because with your follows and with your word of mouth, we can grow the show and get even better and have more influence and, really change public perception, and community engagement will come out of this show. So I'm just really excited about what we're doing here at the Blue Line Project and what we're doing as a company at the Crime Reduction Institute. And this show is brought to you by the Crime Reduction Institute Network. And we're excited to be here. And I've got a lot to do because in the coming weeks, we have some great interviews coming down over the next 2 or 3 episodes that I think you guys are really going to enjoy. The next episode, as I talked about last week, is going to be Assistant Chief Jared Wallace with Waco Police Department. He's going to be here, and we're going to kind of shift gears and talk about officer wellness, which is something that's really passionate to me. Some things that talk personal about me and my story, but more importantly, I want to help my fellow officers and those that are watching this that are in the community to have a better understanding of what officers deal with. This episode, like I said, we're going to target supervisors and command staff. And I've been talking a lot about Sir Robert Peel and his principles and how they play into it. And I believe that his principles are so critically important for us to understand and become better police officers, and for people to understand and connect more with law enforcement. Couple of things that he really emphasized, or Peel does, is number one, prevention over repression. And what we mean that is really emphasizing the idea of crime prevention and crime reduction within the community. And the more that we can teach people how to help themselves and protect themselves, the safer people will be overall. The other thing that I wanted to focus on is public approval. Shows the studies show us that if the public approves, there's a minimal amount of force needed to be used. And we're going to look at some studies that show that, but specifically from a supervisory standpoint. But that's in line with Peel's principles, where he says if you have public approval, you'll have less use of force. And then last but not least, we've talked about it in every episode, is the public are the police and the police are the public. And that is so critically important for us to understand. But when we're talking about use of force and use of force principles and how this actually plays out, so much focus, I believe, has been put on the officer, the individual officer, and are they de-escalating, or how are they handling the situation? How are they creating that time and distance that we talked about? But guess who really, at the end of the day, is the linchpin in any use of force scenario? It's really the supervisor. What kind of a culture is the chief creating in that department? Are they creating a culture of fear? Are they creating a culture of mistrust? And that filters all the way down to the line supervisor. But let's talk about that sergeant or that lieutenant. What are they creating? What kind of leadership role are they taking? What kind of leadership principles are they following? What kind of leader are they? An actional leadership, a transitional leader? There's so many different types of leaders. And we're going to look at some research in this episode that shows what leaders can do better. I'll show you some studies and put them up on the screen, and always they'll be in the comments below. Don't remember that. Any research that we show you here, always be in the comments below. I just want you guys to remember that. We're here. We say we're evidence-based. We mean we're evidence-based. I don't just sit up here and talk, proverbially out of my you-know-what. I want to share with you guys what I've learned through my research and what is happening and where there's been success. So I just want you to remember that. But think about this. If officers operate inside of a pressure situation and they're expected to perform and they have to make tough decisions under pressure, well, what role does a supervisor play in that? Remember in the last episode, we talk about the core principles that happen under stress. What does the officer face? When the officer faces that situation where deadly force or any force may be necessary, perception begins to narrow, right? That get that tunnel vision and things slow down. I remember during my officer involved shooting, everything just seemed to slow down and the target in front of me seemed to be bigger than life, right? Everything was so in tune. Like the front sight on my pistol looked like it was gigantic. And so that's what happens. You get that tunnel vision. It can be good and it can be bad, but we have to understand that that actually happens. The other thing that I remember from my own incident was the auditory exclusion, where I could hear certain things, but not other things. For instance, when I fired and discharged my duty weapon, I actually heard the rounds. I heard them and I counted them and I was actually accurate. It was pretty funny. I remember when the forensics guys came over and they said, "Well, how many rounds did you fire, Officer Gabrielson?" I said, "I fired 3." And they said, "Okay, well, most officers get that wrong, and their perception is wrong because they have auditory exclusion," and so on and so forth. And they counted all my rounds, because they basically take your magazines and they take your duty weapon and they, take the mag out and they count how many rounds, and there should be, 18 plus, or 17 plus 1 in the chamber, and then your mags, right? And then they counted it all out, and they were like, "Wow, you actually did fire 3 rounds." But I just remember that, like, it was weird, but there were other things I don't remember, like car horns, honking and things like that. And then you get time distortion. Even in my incident, it seemed like everything slowed down. When I went back and looked at it, I felt like it was a minute, 2 minutes. In reality, it was a few seconds that I made the decision, shoot, don't shoot, within that split second. But yet everything slowed down. We have to remember this. But this isn't just in a deadly force situation. When officers use force and their blood pressure and things go up, their heart rate goes up. All these things happen. It's physiology, it's physics. There's nothing we can do about it. And then threat cues are amplified in any threat or use of force situation for the officer involved. And how do we know this? Well, there's an institute called Force Science, and they've done a lot of studies, and you can go check their website out. They have a big conference, and I recommend reading their stuff. But psychologists have confirmed by many, many research studies that elevated heart rates, and that's above 150 beats per minute, can really have a significant impact on the officer. So those distortions can affect their cognitive decision making, and it can cause you to have poor performance. It was very interesting when they did some research on officers and shooting. And one of the reasons I think it's so important that we get to the range and are proficient shooters is because let's say you're shooting 100% on the range because of these things, right? Your perception narrows, your occlusion, the time distortion, all of these different things we just talked about it. Your accuracy is probably going to go down, maybe that 10 or 15%. So if you're barely passing your qualifications and now you get into a use of force scenario where you have to, discharge your duty weapon, your firearm, we want to have accurate rounds because we as police officers are accountable for every single round. So that's critically important to just remember. But this show isn't about that. It's about supervisors. So I kind of want to pivot now and talk to my supervisors. Now, those of you who know me are like, "Well, John, how in the world do you have the expertise to talk about supervisors? You're not a supervisor. You've been a senior patrol officer. You spent 13 years on patrol. So what in the heck do you know about supervision?" Well, I may not be personally a supervisor on the street, but I am a senior officer. I've been on multiple critical incidents. I've been involved, one of my own officer involved shooting, as well as multiple uses of force throughout my career, multiple pursuits, multiple foot pursuits. And I've seen and worked for different types of supervisors that have different styles. And I can tell you that the supervisor makes all the difference in the world of how you're going to respond as an officer. And research backs me up and backs up that statement. But let me ask this question. If you are a supervisor listening to this podcast today, you're a lieutenant, you're a sergeant, you're that line supervisor that has troops underneath you immediately. Let me ask you this question. When you arrive on scene, do you press your officers and accelerate pressure, or do you slow things down? Do you demand action, or do you take control of that scene and slow things down? Well, you might say, well, of course I slow things down. But let me ask, do you? What kind of questions do you ask? If your officer comes up on the radio asking for something in a high pressure situation, like to kick a door in, right? What is the questions that you ask? Do you say, hey, hold what you've got? Give me a phone call if there's not an exigent circumstance? Think about that. The only time we're going to be kicking in a door is if we have true exigent circumstance, like immediate risk to life. But if we have the option to slow things down, you as a supervisor need to take that option. And that begins on the radio. And I think about even in a pursuit. Think about in a pursuit, an officer makes a traffic stop or whatever. Let's say they have a felony warrant or something happens and bam, a pursuit happens, right? The officer's excited. First, you're going to listen to their tone on the radio, right? Are they calm? Are they calling the, direct, are they calling the way they should? Are they giving you, time? Are they giving you speed? Are they giving you, how many people are in the vehicle? Are they to get you a license plate number or 28 as we call it? What is the officer? Are they able to actually give direction of travel, cross streets, et cetera, right? So you're looking at those things. But what's the first question? And I got to say, the department I work at, it happens pretty regularly. The first question is, hey, what do you have? What does that question do? That question allows the officer to slow things down and think about, hey, what do I have? What am I pursuing for? In any use force situation, rather than rush in if we don't have to, slowing things down, we have to buy time. But it also reduces emotional cognition, right? It allows you to take some of the emotion out, take that deep breath and slow things down, right? Because remember, your role is to supervise your troops and create an environment in which they can make the best decision possible. Time doesn't just appear out of thin air. Leadership protects it. Leadership helps guide it. So the type of leader that you are on the street with your troops, and we're going to look at some studies here in a few minutes, is really going to play a major, major role when we're talking about use of force type scenarios. So, what does it look like for an officer to slow the scene? He asks the right question, the supervisor does. Hold what we got. What do you have? What resources are available? What do you still need? Right? Slowing things down. You're allowing the officer to gain cognitive bandwidth. Hey, I'm en route. Right? These are things that you want to do. You want to get that officer to lower their emotions the best that they possibly can. And you can do that with very calm, well-pointed radio traffic. When you do that and the officer trusts you because they know you're calm as a supervisor, all the research says it's going to help them make better decisions on the street. But if you're a supervisor who either doesn't respond, isn't paying attention to the radio, doesn't say a whole lot, or unfortunately may accelerate a scene, if you accelerate a scene too fast or don't have all the facts on the ground, then time collapses, distance then closes, and the use of force may become more likely. Now, are there times where this isn't possible? Absolutely. If somebody's threatening with a weapon and the officer has to take action, they have to take action. That's what we're talking about. But you have to look at every single aspect of this and realize what you can do as a supervisor to slow things down. It's really interesting. I made a note here that studies on supervisor style shows that an active leadership style that correlates, wants the officers to get out there and things like that, can have both a positive and a negative, right? The active supervisor is encouraging officers to do more, right? Encouraging them to press, encouraging them to take that. So guess what? At that kind of supervisor may have officers that have more use of force, but they may have higher arrest rates and other things as well. Versus, let's say, more of a transactional leader, right? Who wants to educate their officers, get officers to slow things down, and really pays attention to some of the cues and gets to know their officers in a transactional kind of a way. Research says that those type of supervisors actually have lower use of force within their shifts. But setting all of that aside, I want to shift gears for a minute when we're talking about use of force and the supervisory role. In the last episode, you heard me talk about procedural justice. And in procedural justice, I talked about how important it is to build trust within the community. But guess what? Is there procedural justice within your own shift? Is there procedural justice within your own department? I want you to think about that for a minute. Let that sink in. Because procedural justice not only works to slow things down and gain more time and gain more trust on the street, which last week we proved through research and evidence actually lowers use of force. But guess what? From an internal perspective, procedural justice among your officers will improve field performance. Absolutely will improve field performance. Again, studies show this. Let me ask this to my sergeants, my lieutenants, my line supervisors that are listening to this podcast right now. Do officers feel heard on your shift? Do officers feel that they have a voice and you actually listen to what they have to say and actually consider it? Do your officers trust the disciplinary process within your agency? Do they feel that it is unbiased? Do they feel that it is trustworthy? And do they feel that they actually have a voice? Think about that. Do officers on your shift believe you have their back? Do they believe the agency has their back, or will the agency throw them under the bus because it's politically expedient? I think to Derek Chauvin and what happened in Minneapolis, I'm not defending what Officer Chauvin did. But after further review of the evidence and news reports that came out later show that George Floyd died of a drug overdose and not from asphyxiation. It was also shown that the Minneapolis Police Department had in their training manual the exact technique that Chauvin was using as an approved restraint technique. And there was much more evidence. But yet, it was politically expedient to rush to judgment, send him to trial, convict him. When I first saw that, was with everybody else. I thought what he did was wrong, was horrible, and I still think it could have been done better. And I think there were things that those officers should have done that they didn't do, like get him up, move him in a different position, so on and so forth. But I want to set that aside. How do you think the way he was treated, and now that he's in prison and he's been stabbed multiple times, how do you think that affects other officers? Or in my own city, here in Austin, the department does back our officers, but we have a district attorney who seeks to prosecute our officers and make up crazy charges like deadly conduct and twisting the statute into knots to the point where the state legislator had to step in here in Texas, say you can't use deadly conduct like that, and they had to tighten it up. My point being, when an officer doesn't feel supported, it really can affect their overall decision making. And unfortunately, we're probably going to get the opposite effect of you're either going to get too aggressive or too much force, or the officer isn't going to do what needs to be done. If the officer operates from a point of internal fear, then the officer is setting themselves up to failure, and that fear can turn into excess. But when you create an environment of procedural justice by giving your officers a voice, being neutral in your actions, trustworthy in your motives, then officers feel that you have their back. They can slow things down, know that they can make a decision process go slower, react in a situation knowing that you're not gonna Monday morning quarterback that scenario, but if they do make a mistake that you will pull them aside, counsel them, and make it a learning opportunity. I will tell you in my career, I never did it all right. I made mistakes, I made some bad decisions, but nothing that ever cost me my career because I was fortunate to have supervisors that were very transactional. "Hey, yes, this was a success, Officer Gabrielson, but, what was your consideration at this point?" And I always could give them my reasoning of why I did what I did. But then they, "Well, maybe next time you could think about it this way, or if you would have done this, we would have had this happen over here." That is critically important for officers to know that even if they make a mistake, you as a supervisor, as a department, are gonna have their back because internal legitimacy produces external legitimacy and helps your officers. And I wanna bring in a couple studies as I have done in a couple other weeks, and I took some notes. I have them here in front of me, um, as I look down. A couple different studies. There's one, Ingalls did a study back in 2000, and the title of the study is "The Effects of Supervisory Styles on Patrol Officers' Behavior." And basically, they were in Indianapolis and St. Petersburg, and they did and looked at 4 different styles of supervising: traditional, an innovative, supportive, and an active or a hands-on, type of, leading by example on the street. Interesting enough, in this study in 2000, the key findings here as I'm reading some of the notes from the study, active supervisors had the strongest influence on patrol officers. Well, that stands to reason, right? They're in the field, they're out there with their officers, they're out there with their troops. Hey, I always loved the supervisor that would come out in the field that took calls with me. I had several, whether it was back then Sergeant Murphy or Sergeant Kraus or some of the other sergeants that I had the honor to work for, they would be out in the field with us. And I always appreciated that. So they were active and led by example. But interesting enough, in the study, officers under active supervisors were twice as likely to use force against suspects compared to those under other styles. So, an active supervisor, the one that comes to mind is I believe he's retired now, but one of my sergeants downtown, he would always be on 6th Street with us, and we got into a lot of use of force and a lot of fights and things dealing with the bar district and drunks. And he actually broke his leg and, he was always out there with us right in the fray of it. And I'm not saying that was a bad thing, but this study from my own personal experience has bore out. Because an active supervisor is probably more likely to use force themselves along with their troops. But the implications of this study showed us that leadership by example is both positive and negative because a leader that leads by example is gonna be out there solving problems, gonna be with his troops, he's gonna command and demand respect. He's gonna get that respect because he's right there with them in the fray, in the fight, day in and day out. So, there's something to be said about that. Um, and according to this, there's gonna be more research done, and they've done some other studies even as late as 2022, about use of force and how supervisors and the different types, of leadership style, what actually works. I'm a supportive of more of the transactional type of a leadership style, as it relates to this, but really there's more research to be done. Here's another one, Owens et al. From 2018. The title of this is "Procedurally Fair Supervision Debriefs," referenced in multiple reviews. It was also referenced in a 2022 study. Basically, they did a randomized control trial with high-risk officers, and here's what they did. The treatment group received non-disciplinary supervisor meeting, and procedural justice type training, right? So they taught them about fairness, voice, respect, and neutrality, right? And then every time they would debrief an incident or incident use of force, they would debrief it with fairness, voice, respect, neutrality, right? And they saw success and improvement just in the first weeks. Like, and the study actually says 6 weeks post those initial meetings, those high risk officers who had high levels of use of force had a dramatic reduction in the use of force. Then they looked at the control group and they just did very matter of fact debriefs, no procedural justice, and the use of force remained high. Another great study. And there's a tool that I use if you guys want to know where I find a lot of these studies. I mean, you can use AI and all that, but if you want a really good tool, the evidence-based policing matrix is really good. If you just type evidence-based policing matrix, you can go down and find all of these key studies. And again, I will put these studies in the details below this podcast. So let's look at one more study here. This is a study from it was originally in 2015 and then again in 2025, a Lim et al. Study on supervisor education. And I found this pretty interesting because, supervisors go through, supervisor school and they learn how to be a supervisor and they learn, how to read their officers and different things like this. But one of the things that came out in this study was supervisor impairment training. So they actually teach supervisors how to look for officer impairment. And then they looked at use of force. So supervisors' use of force training increased. And basically, this showed that if you look for impairment with your officers, taught supervisors about better use of force training and how it can be done through ICATs, de-escalation, and things like that. You actually saw really good effects on officers and the use of force. True supervisory training then looks and targets education to officers higher at risk, teaching them more restraint and understanding what impairments they may have that can lead to higher uses of force. This study shows that if you address those issues and then brought in procedural justice as well, again, you could see a lower, use of force incident. So you might ask, what is supervisor impairment training? Basically, if you go to traditional supervisor school, they teach you how to look for drugs and different things like that, coming in late, performance type of things, alcohol, mental health. This training actually has a key purpose and content. And so it teaches, and I just took some notes here, but it teaches recognition. So they're not only looking for the behavioral, physical, and performance cues of impairment. So specifically, they're taught to look for erratic behavior in the officer and poor decision making. So they're actually looking at how the officer operates on the street in their everyday activities. And they're looking for those two main things as well as absenteeism and other things like fatigue and tiredness and things like that. Then they use response protocols. So they then bring the officer in and they do things like remove them from duty, getting them into an early, EAP program, fitness for duty evaluations. They do things other than the disciplinary process. So they try a whole sort of things during this impairment training. The officer supervisors learn how to then try to treat those things and get them into the right program to hopefully get a good response from the officer. And this protects the officer's well-being and helps them become less of a liability to the department. The last part of that would be the disciplinary process. The goal is to try to get corrective behavior through this type of training. What we've learned with this kind of training is it builds a culture where the supervisors become more proactive and they have better wellness checks. The officers do things like good stress management, working out together. One of the things that our commander instituted with our patrol guys out of our substation is they have, fitness days where they get together with the commander and they might go for a run or they might go for some kind of a hike or some kind of fitness. So now you're building camaraderie, stress management, and all those different things. So just some really cool things. There's been, like I said, lots of studies that show that officers that get this kind of, supervisors that get this kind of training and then implement it and actually use it can actually have lower use of force among their officers. So let's tie this as we close. I want to tie this to Sir Robert Peel because I don't know if you notice a trend in each podcast. I go back to Peel because I believe so passionately about Peel's principles. Because if we followed his principles, it would make us so much more legitimate than we already are. Peel says effectiveness depends on public approval, right? But if we have officers that are using excessive force or the appearance of excessive force because of media narratives, we lose public approval. If we lose public approval, like I said in the last podcast, we might as well go home. So where does this actually start as we close out the show? It starts with leadership culture and a kind of leadership of which we're bringing. And I truly believe right now, as I look around law enforcement, and I say this with all respect to my chiefs, we have a leadership crisis in law enforcement. I see way too many chiefs, way too many sheriffs either becoming way too politically correct, buying into every BS narrative that comes down the pike, or they don't really say anything. They don't back their officers. They're just kind of there. And I don't see enough supervisors and chiefs really stepping forward and taking responsibility and introducing these things. Now, I'm fortunate at my department that we have really good supervisors, and I believe our chief is doing a wonderful job. And as she is evidence based and the things that she's doing. So I'm blessed, but I can't say that for every agency that's out there. But what we have learned today is that you have to be procedurally just outside the department, inside the department, because that boosts commitment, well being of the officers. It allows for a more open and fair internal atmosphere, which will automatically translate to the outside. So, in closing, what then do you as a supervisor actually control? And this is going to be kind of a tactical but slash practical application for my supervisors that are listening. And I wrote down 5 things that I've discovered through my research, through understanding and researching for science that you as an officer or that you can do as a supervisor to help your officers slow down. Number 1 is pace. As a supervisor, don't be afraid to slow things down. Slowing things down is not a weakness. You're actually helping your officer do a better job. Slowing things down is you controlling the scene, allowing de-escalation to actually work. And creating that time will reduce force and injuries without risking officer safety. I can tell you when I was down on 6th Street, we had a young officer, and this happened with most of the young officers. They would come down to 6th Street and fights would break out and the young officers would want to run in. And I can't tell you how many times I grabbed a young officer by the vest and pulled them back. And they're like, "What are you doing, Officer Gabrielson?" Or they called me Gabe. "Hey, what are you doing, Gabe?" And I'd be like, "Hey, man, oh, let them fight it for a minute. There's no blood. It's just a pushing and a shoving, right? We'll blow our whistles, we'll move in, and then we'll take control of it. Because if you run in, you're going to end up in the middle of something far worse. They might even realize you're a police officer because they are in a fight. They're not focused on you. So again, creating that time and distance. I did it all the time with young officers. So slow it down. That's the first thing. Control the pace of a scene. Number 2, come up with some kind of a containment strategy because your containment strategy is going to create time and distance. And remember, the more time you can create on a scene, the more options you have. Right? So pretty simple. Number 1, control the pace. Number 2, come up with some kind of a containment strategy. And then that might need that if you have a barricaded subject that maybe you're calling SWAT or something else. Number 3, for my supervisors, understand your resource deployment. Call for SWAT, call for specialized units, call for things that you need. Bring out your crisis intervention team. Bring out a hostage negotiator if you need one. Know what you have in your toolbox and don't be afraid to use it. Again, don't feel that you have to press the scene. Slow things down, take time. When I was a SWAT scribe for about 5 years back in 2000, I guess 8-ish, I had a really good time. Now, I want to be clear. I was not on SWAT. I was a SWAT scribe. I basically sat in a command center and I wrote notes. Okay, I want to get that clear. But I had a really cool opportunity to watch how SWAT operated and to see how they went about getting containment, how they went about getting sectorization, and then how it looked from the command post standpoint and how they slowed things down and everything was methodical and done in a systematic order. It was like clockwork. And that's how SWAT officers bring themselves home safely and can resolve incidents the way that they did, in such a masterful way. So it was really fascinating to watch. But they knew their resources and they were methodical in their deployment. You have to be the same way as a sergeant. And number 4, what's your tone on the radio? Do you get frantic? Do you get excited? Do you raise your voice? Are you screaming like a little girl, or you tone? Do you have that nice temperance to bring it down? Really, really important. And then what is your post incident narrative? Do you reward quick resolution, or do you reward officers slowing the pace? Do you reward a safe conclusion? And then how do you debrief that? Are you accusatory? Do you walk through the mistakes? Do you seek how to do things better? Do you seek to build officers up? Remember this. I remember this with my kids. I remember this when I was a supervisor in the private sector. And even when I'm doing community engagement stuff, if you praise people for certain things, you get more of that behavior. If I praise my kids for good behavior, I get more good behavior. So just remember that. Praise your officers. Don't be so quick to tear them down. Find the good things that they did and then be willing to talk about that which they can do better the next time around. That's why you have those debriefs. And don't forget those. Don't forget those. So, in closing, you have to ask hard questions. So, I'm going to ask you, and I wrote these questions down. I'm going to ask you 3 hard questions. And I want you to answer these honestly as my supervisors watching this podcast. Number 1, do you celebrate arrests more than judgment? Answer to yourself. Do you celebrate arrests more than judgment? Number 2, do you praise activity more than restraint? Do you praise activity more than restraint? Do we promote tactical aggression over tactical patience? Because remember, force reduction is not achieved through policy alone. It's achieved when you, as a supervisor, are helping your troops be better, slowing things down, protecting time, giving more distance, reinforcing communication, and normalizing disengagement when appropriate. I want you to ask those questions. What culture are you creating? Because if you create this kind of a culture where officers can feel safe, officers know that you have their back, they know that you're promoting these things, that your pace is slowing it down, that you're giving them good strategies, you got a good tone on the radio, then not only are you going to gain the support of your officers, but you're going to gain support of the public. You can train patience and reward speed. And those are the things that I want you to think about. You can't, excuse me, I messed up. You can't train patience and reward speed, right? That's what we don't want to do. You want to reward patience, right? And not speed. You want to reward patience and not speed. You want your officers to slow things down. So remember, leadership, then bringing it back full circle, is truly a force multiplier. And we need good leaders in law enforcement. Most people, again, think about force as tactics, but force science tells us it's not about tactics. It's about perception. How does the public see us? That perception then becomes reality. And where does perception begin? Yes, it begins with the officer, but it also begins with the environment that the supervisor creates and allows that officer to be the best that they can be. Remember, the police are the public and the public are the police. It's not always about optics, it's about legitimacy. And we want to build that legitimacy. We want to lead differently. We want to be transactional in our leadership. And we want to lower force because we're being good leaders and we're holding our officers to that standard because we ourselves hold that. Remember to be evidence-based. Like I said, go back, check out Force Science. You can go to their website, check out their work and see what's done. Go look at these different studies that I talked about and do your own research. Like I said in the last episode, I don't want you guys to believe anything that I say. I want you to go do your own research, become a better supervisor, understand procedural justice, right? Give your officers voice and be there for them when they need it the most so that they have someone to lean on. And that goes from my line supervisors all the way up to my chiefs that are listening to this podcast. Well, if you like this podcast, please like and share it with your friends. Let's build our viewership. We can do this together. And thank you so much for being with us and being here on the Blue Line Project, brought to you by the Crime Reduction Institute. Remember, like this video, follow us, Rumble, YouTube, and wherever this podcast can be found. This is John Gabrielson signing off for the Blue Line Project.